I know it's a lovely day out. Attendance is a little off and it is recorded, but I am really trying to be organized and give you the best information possible because I want to do um, a good job for you. Today, whoops, my special guest is a guinea fowl, an African chicken that makes sure that there are no ticks or fleas in my yard. They're very expensive if you go to Whole Foods. Oh, shut up. They're also very, as you can hear, very good watchbirds. A very useful animal to have. This is a guinea hen. Anyway, you go back in there, guinea. I got all sorts of stuff crawling around out there. Anyway, back to, yes, Juniper came in, hearing the animal. It's her job to guard them. Anyway. Okay. Back to the real world. Back to the real world, we have a couple of announcements. We have one of our little mini quizzes that I will post Thursday and it'll be due Friday based on either today's or Thursday's presentation. So we'll do that. 5 points, extra credit, no deduction for missing it or not doing it. So it's just there as a special extra little thing for the grades. We'll finish up next time with the 19th century, and we'll have, oh no, a test next week. The thing is though, there's a little less application and a little bit more fact on this test, so people should do a little better. So you'll be doing fine. I'm about half done with grading the essays. We've got a few more hundreds. People are putting in the effort. I have made the point of this is what it takes to get from a 95 to 100. A 95, do the basics, you still get an A. That extra 5 is for extra effort. Several people have done so. So, and again, essays usually help your overall grades. Folks are doing fine. Anyway, today we'll talk about the Civil War. Civil War is where things really changed as far as communication. Frankly, communication in the Revolutionary War was about the same as the time of Gutenberg. Messages by horseback, printing press worked about the same, but things changed a lot different in the 7 years from the Revolution to the Civil War. Show you a little bit. Should have had this queued up. Okay. Here's an overview.
With online newspapers, social networks, and television, less and less people open a newspaper to catch up on current events. During the Civil War, for the more public news, newspapers were used. The newspaper industry itself evolved during the war.
Yes, if you remember, really newspapers were the mass media during this era. So we'll talk a little about them because that's the only thing everybody saw. And if you remember, with the high-speed press that we talked about last week, a lot more newspapers.
And grew to be what it is today. Since the Civil War was supposed to be a short war, the demand for news was massive for the soldiers and the citizens. The people wanted to know how their side was doing. In order to meet the demand, rotary presses were invented. This type of printing press could provide papers for a whole city opposed to a whole town in one night.
And what difference do you think that made? Anybody can chime in. What difference did that make? Remember, more papers, the cost goes down and readership goes up. More people are reading. More people are reading the same things, then you have more people tied together. They're reading the same news in the city and the country, same events. And again, we talk about more literacy. It's not just rich white guys anymore. It's middle-class people, women, people of color. They're all starting to participate in society because if you remember all the way back from the beginning, the growth of literacy brings more people into a society.
Another way that information was spread was through photography. The camera was just emerging at the time of the Civil War. The process of taking and developing a picture took time and skill. It required two men quickly mixing trays of chemicals and pouring them over sheets of glass. Cameras were very large and would be set onto specially built wagons. Photography was a way for people to see the battlefield from a safe distance and preserve the historic scenes.
We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but the point is that remember what photography did? It made people more, photographs give you emotion. It's visceral. You look at it and you go, oh, wow. It brings more emotion. It brings more reality. It brings the war into people's homes. It's the war isn't 2,000 miles away anymore. It's right in front of you. If you remember, actually, you were probably kids at the time when the big documentary, The Civil War, came out on PBS. Well, they were able to bring it to life because they had the pictures to do voiceovers. But before that, you just had paintings.
The telegraph was the quickest way.
Yes, the telegraph. Guess what's right here? What's right here? This is Chattanooga. Hold on a second.
For information to be shared throughout the country.
Put Juniper outside.
A battle in Georgia could be reported to Washington in a matter of minutes. Telegraph operators would follow the troops to the battlefront and set up telegraph poles and wires right where the action was happening. Using Morse code, a trained operator would send and interpret messages. This system allowed leaders to make decisions and relay them to the generals or commanders much quicker than a messenger could ride the message. Airplanes were not invented at the time of the Civil War. The only way to see your enemy from above was in a hot air balloon. These early balloons could rise up to 5,000 feet in the air and were often tethered to the ground. The balloonist would communicate enemy positions and camps to the ground, and the information would be telegraphed back to main camp.
There you go. You started to have air power. You have a war not in 2 dimensions, but 3, up in the air, and with the telegraph, you're able to signal where people are.
Unfortunately, before the end of the war, the balloon program disbanded due to financial reasons. Balloons were a safer way to scout out an area, but were expensive to build.
This is the point in this overview, that in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, even though people read, you're all in a little different village. You're in different towns, you're in different states. But with the media, with the growth of the media pulling people together, you have more of a unified nation. People started thinking of themselves more as a nation, and things are moving faster everywhere. Okay, we'll go back to see the new technologies, the high-speed press, photography, and the telegraph. We'll talk a little bit more about the press. Again, many more faster, lower cost newspapers. If everyone's reading the newspaper, you have some changes. For example, what do you think, again, increased literacy? More people reading, people of different backgrounds, all getting involved in the life of the country. It's not just white male property holders anymore. And this is really what the mass media looked like. You started to see illustrations. And we'll talk a little bit more about the illustrations in a few minutes. But you can see our media is starting to get more visual. And you got this guy. He was very aware of using the media. He was very active. We will get to that in a bit too. Illustrated newspapers. Again, society is starting to be more visual. And when we talk about photography and reproduction, you'll see why. Again, people are starting to think more in terms of pictures. And remember what pictures give us? They give us emotion. They give us just not just information. You really feel, oh, wow, this is what the battlefield looks like. It's one thing to it's one thing to read about it and put it in your mind's eye, but here it is for real. Reminding people what this is all about. And so much for unbiased opinions. You have the cartoons in the front, on the front page. So there is less opinion. I mean, there is opinion everywhere. But it was different. You notice these are all Northern or British newspapers. In the South, you had, as the war went on, you had less paper. You had shortages of ink and less printing. The newspapers didn't circulate as much, so you're not getting as much news, and it's kind of boring to look at. So it's not as inspiring as a real magazine using illustrations. Again, the Confederacy had fewer printing presses, a paper shortage. They didn't get this sort of idea that we're all in this together. That's another part of the Civil War. The Civil War was about, and it's an argument we're having today. The Confederate States thought of themselves as separate, almost separate countries. They were different states. They were not a union. They were confederated. So the media, each town had its own newspaper. But in the North, you have big ideas and big cities tying the country together. People are all reading the same news, much less so in the South. You know, on this, in my early class, a student asked me, was it really about slavery? Well, you can ask it, certainly yes, but you can ask different historians different things. The South did want to have more separatism and states' rights, but it's even in the Confederate Constitution. Among those rights is the ownership of another human being. So it's really there. But you can see the difference in the newspapers. And they really did make a difference. This is one of the more powerful things that happened, the Gettysburg Address. The media had, it's 200 words. Lincoln didn't think it was all that exciting. What did the media do how did mass media bring the Gettysburg Address into the public eye and make it worthwhile? Anybody? Something like the Gettysburg Address. Why did that come a big deal? And what about the media? I know. My earlier class, they actually kind of got into this. I'll show you.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, at Big Bend, Big Sandy, and the Big Sunflower River. From Bunker Hill, West Virginia, and Blue Springs, Tennessee, Cairo, Illinois, to Golgotha Church, Georgia, and Christiansburg, Kentucky. At Citrus Point on the Cimarron River, and along Cowskin Bottom. At Pebbly Run and La Glorieta Pass, and Gettysburg.
I think if I had my choice of all the moments to be present at in that war period, it would be at Gettysburg during Lincoln's delivery of his speech. Maybe to have seen him craft those beautiful words, his marvelous healing words, and then deliver them. They were for everyone for all time. They subsumed the entire war, all in it. It showed his compassion for everyone, his love for his people. That's where I'd like to be.
On November 19th, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the new Union Cemetery. The featured speaker was Edward Everett of Massachusetts, a diplomat, clergyman, and celebrated orator. The president had been invited almost as an afterthought to offer a few appropriate remarks. Everett spoke for not quite 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose. A local photographer took his time focusing. Presumably, the president could be counted on to go on for a while. But he spoke just 269 words. He started off by reminding his audience that just 87 years had passed since the founding of the nation. And then he went on to embolden the Union cause with some of the most stirring words ever spoken. Lincoln was heading back to his seat before the photographer could open the shutter.
He felt that he had failed, that it was a poor speech, that the people didn't like it. It was so brief, less than 2 minutes. He felt that he had failed. Layman, his friend Ward Layman, was sitting next to him on the stand. When he sat down, there was just a sprinkling of applause. And he said, "Layman, that speech won't scowl. That's what you say about a plow in the prairies when the mud doesn't come off it."
The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. Chicago Times.
Dear Mr. President, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes.
All right. He's up there. And Lincoln, who had a high squeaky voice, by the way, does his thing. And it's 2 minutes, he sits down, people go. Edward Everett speaks for 2 hours, and people think it's pretty good. What's the difference did the media make? Any guesses? They thought if you were there, wasn't a big deal. Well, the difference is that it was 269 words. 269 words, fits in a box 4 by 5 inches in a newspaper. You can read it. 2 hours worth of words is pages and pages and pages. Doesn't look good in print. But when you read the Gettysburg Address, it's like, oh, wow. When you repeat it out loud, again, goes back to the Phoenicians, that ability to read a phonetic alphabet and share it and see it in the media, that made all the difference. The difference was it was in the newspapers and everybody saw it.
Edward Everett.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
That all men are dedicated, that all men, all people are created equal. Not black and white, that all people.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that their nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take in.
You want to see a war memorial? There you have one. It's a quarter-mile behind, it's and adjacent to our campus. Those people gave their lives for this country. Think about it. They are there every day. It's right next to our campus.
Increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
See, talks about the government and the people who gave their lives for the government. Now, we can argue about how much government we should have, how far it should go. But it is about having a government that represents the people of this country. That these people behind our building died for. And I think about it every day I'm there. That again, it's a government by the people, not the king. Again, we can argue about how much government, but a government by, with, and for the people. And, you know, you can talk about hating the government. The government is what this country was founded on, making a new kind of government. So think about that. Okay. That guy Lincoln, he knew what he was doing. He posed for pictures all the time. He was called the manipulator in chief. I'll go through this fairly quickly. According to studies and the power of the press, Lincoln, again, was accused, and he did. We had the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, and he used it. If he disagreed with people, he threw them in jail. He suspended habeas corpus, which means he could put somebody in jail without even charging him. So a lot of people thought Lincoln was a dictator. And a lot of the reason for that was, again, he used the media. He planted stories, letters to the editor. He wrote and put them in the media, sent letters to the newspapers. He posed for pictures. You see his picture everywhere. It's one of the first Photoshop tricks is they put his head on a heftier body when he was first elected, so he would look more commanding. He knew what he was doing. Yep. So he likes the newspaper and he likes being in the paper. Again, he planted stories. He wrote so it would appear in stories. He put his picture everywhere. He was one of the first modern media manipulators as president. Okay. And then here we go again with photography. Go a little bit more in depth from where we were before.
Most photographs in the years after photography was invented in 1839 would have been daguerreotypes, after its inventor, Louis Daguerre. They were also making...
Guess who? 1848. He was in Congress. And in my earlier class, I asked a lot about slavery, and he was kind of squishy about it. It was during the war where he said the war had to really mean something than just a war between the states. And that's a big part of the motivation for the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, because he wanted it to be more about the states. He wanted to make it about something transcendent in slavery. So again, young guy, like to have his picture taken, like to have him spread around, and we'll show why.
Tintypes, but both of these processes made single positives. You could not easily make a copy of these photos. You had to take another photo of that photo to make a copy. But the invention of the wet plate process was the first real widespread process that actually created a photographic negative, a piece of glass on which the image was affixed through some light-sensitive chemicals and a sticky substance called collodion. If you took that negative and put a black background behind it, that negative became a positive, and that is essentially an ambrotype. If, however, you took that negative and put it against some light sensitive, maybe albumin paper, suddenly you could print that photograph in the sun. You could do it again and again and again, and you could make 1,000 prints from one photo.
There you go. You can distribute the photos in a way you couldn't before. So people really saw what was going on in the war. Check this out.
You could also take that photographic print or that photographic negative, lend it to an artist who could make an engraving or a woodcut out of it. And those things, those processes could be printed in newspapers of the time. Harper's Weekly had 1 million subscribers.
See, remember I showed you before the illustrated newspapers? You didn't have much of that before. But with photography, you can take a picture and then you can bring it into the office and someone could make an engraving, like a potato or woodblock cut out of it, put that in the paper, so people started seeing things. And who do we see all the time? This guy with his young son, who unfortunately died shortly thereafter. But again, he's very consciously putting his picture, father of the country, he's a good guy. This is not just, this was not an accident. He was very conscious about his image.
At that time. So one photo could be seen by 1 million people as an engraving or a woodcut. These photographers also sold photos, and most of these photos are also being sold using the wet plate process by printing cartes de visite. People had
early Robert E. Lee. Again, if remember, photography started in the 1830s and got real popular, spread just as fast as the cell phone. This was just a few years after photography was invented, probably 18.
And calling cards of their own image they could hand out to people, and also through stereo views. Most photographers' outdoor views were recorded using a twin.
Does this look familiar? Should. It's right around here. People, this part of the world, what became very popular because it's so scenic. Also, a lot of photos were taken in the Chattanooga area because the photographers and the soldiers were here 3 months. There were lots of battles coming back and forth because this was a key area. So when you have a lot of people, you have a lot of people taking pictures.
Twin lens camera an eye width apart. And by doing that, putting these things on a special card into a viewer, they could see these pictures in 3D. And in that fashion, there was a huge craze in the 1850s and 60s by which people could travel the world by looking at photos in their 3D viewer. These very processes actually led to the birth of photojournalism, in my opinion, which started in 1862 on the Virginia Peninsula. After securing photos of not so fresh graves at Manassas, on the Virginia Peninsula, suddenly Union photographers, Northern photographers are securing fresh graves, and then a field hospital, and then going.
Remember, if things move, they get blurry. What stands still? Dead people. So they bring back pictures of the horrible things that happen in a war.
North were dead horses on the Cedar Mountain battlefield before coming here where we stand at Antietam, where they secured 20 photos of dead soldiers on the battlefield. And these photos, when they were debuted in New York and elsewhere, shocked the nation. This was not a glorious war. This showed grotesque, bloated soldiers far from home, face pressed to the earth. It was not what they had pictured a battlefield to be. And suddenly, it really changed people's perception of war. only on a few more occasions, notably at Corinth, Mississippi, at Fredericksburg twice, at Gettysburg, at Spotsylvania, and Petersburg, were Union photographers able to secure photos of the dead where they fell.
Yeah, they talk about the beginnings of photojournalism. It's not PR, it's not selfies posing, it's showing what really happened. And we kind of learned our lessons. If you notice, you don't see too many pictures from Afghanistan. President Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, none of them wanted you to see the pictures of our people being killed. So they limited the access to of photographers because they didn't want you to see this.
So it's a very finite resource, 97 photos taken of dead soldiers on battlefields in total, and that's why we study them very carefully. There are other important things to know about Civil War photography, such as that most Civil War photos were taken by Union photographers in the East. The South quickly ran out of photochemicals. The blockade really worked. And, you know, these chemicals.
So you have it in the printing shows pictures from the Northern perspective. The South ran out of photography equipment, chemicals. So you didn't have that that real powerful image that you saw, that the Northerners saw.
Chemicals were slow to reach to the West, and the vast distances.
Here we are, by the way.
Between battlefields in the West compared to the East made it so that most photos were recorded by Union photographers in the East. These photographers managed to secure at Charleston a photo of actual combat, and you see troop movements actually at Second Battle of Fredericksburg. But there are also a lot of myths associated with Civil War photography. You know, people are suggesting that photographers are moving bodies all around to get the perfect view, which they are known to have done only once. People suggest that Civil War negatives all have washed away in people's greenhouses, which is just not the case. And there are scores of other myths associated with Civil War photography, but the negatives are there. That we know where the negatives are, and by the way, they're almost entirely at the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, which are high-res online, as well as at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We can see just about all of the 10,000 documentary photos taken during the Civil War. We know which ones they took. We have catalogs. But the negatives themselves were much larger than the 35mm negatives that most of us grew up with. Rather, they were 4 by 10 inches or even larger than that, 20 or 30 times larger than negatives on a 35mm camera. Therefore, you can blow up and see.
The optics of a lens was no better than the optics we have today. They had bigger negatives, so when they blow it up, the image didn't degrade. So not only did we get images, we got accurate and sharp images. As a matter of fact, the optics are no better today than they were 170 years ago.
See great details within photos. You can catch people smiling in Civil War photos. You can actually read names on gravestones, things that the photographers could have had no hope of doing. So go to the Library of Congress site, check out the National Archives website, browse through these photos together and learn something on your own about the Civil War.
The point is that, again, the Civil War came into our homes. While it was going on, you didn't just read about it. You saw it, you felt it. And we remember it today because we still have these pictures. There's some quick facts. Was the first major conflict to be extensively documented through photography. There were some folks, and I showed you from the Mexican War, but the technology was so primitive, you weren't able to make a lot of copies, that you didn't see much of it. The Civil War, you were able to make copies, engravings, you were able to put it in the media. So people really saw the war. Not only the dead bodies, but the action, the people. You saw Grant, you saw Lincoln. You didn't really see much of Robert E. Lee until he retired. But again, you really saw the war mostly in the North. tying those villages together. It was all a shared experience, whether you're in New York or Massachusetts or Ohio, you all reading the same information. Southern photographers took pictures too, but most were made in the North. Again, the Northerners saw more. It perhaps unified them more. The Southerners didn't have as many newspapers, so, and limited circulation. You're in your own state, you're in your own town. You don't see the big interconnected world the way the people in the North did. Wet plate process made reproduction, so you can see pictures everywhere. Yeah, lots of portraits. That was still the thing, but we actually documented what it was really like. Wet plate negatives, better quality. Yes, a lot of dead bodies because they stood still. 3D pictures, we talked a little about that. Combat photography as it happened. The idea that you could document history, not just show a portrait of a general, that you could document history as it happens, came from the Civil War. So you see the high-speed press brought it into more homes. Photography made it more real and emotional. And then we have the telegraph. The telegraph was a big deal because you have instant communication. Audiences knew who won and lost immediately, not 2 or 3 weeks later. It brought the war and a daily newspaper into your home as it happened, almost in real time. Lincoln, wise person that he is, or was, kept track of the troops, and Grant also understood communications and how armies could be coordinated and moved. Grant was not an artillery person. He wasn't a cavalry person. He wasn't an infantry person. He was a supply guy. He knew how to move stuff around. And you give him the telegraph, he could move supplies and armies from Tennessee to Virginia or Pennsylvania. He was able to see where the opening was and bring the supplies from Alabama to up Route 11 now to Cummings Highway to Chattanooga to relieve the siege. On the south, Bedford Forrest sees what a difference the telegraph can make. So anytime he sees the army, he doesn't attack head on. He circles around. He cuts the telephone, the telegraph wires first, so the troops could be isolated, so they can't get reinforcements. After he cut the communication lines, then he attacked. Again, Bedford Forrest understood the importance of communication.
A healthy mouth is the gateway to a healthy body. That's why Quip electric toothbrushes, toothpaste, and
It would become Lincoln's nerve center in this war. And at its heart, a simple device that will.
Lincoln built a communication center inside the White House. He was able to see and get communications from Vicksburg in the west, from Virginia in the east, Chattanooga and Atlanta in the south. He knows what's going on all over every minute of the day. Jefferson Davis had no such opportunity. He didn't know if the opportunities in Mississippi, if the army in Vicksburg, Mississippi was doing, he didn't know what they were up to while Lee was fighting in Virginia. He could not coordinate his facilities the way Lincoln did.
Will transform how this war is fought and won. The telegraph. The invention of Morse code in 1844 turns the telegraph into America's first tool of mass communication. Quickly encoded, the basic system of dots and dashes sealed for brief messages. Like Twitter today, it needs just seconds to send them and transcribe them. Where messengers previously took days on horseback, over hundreds of miles, and across every kind of terrain. Now, the country's 50,000-mile telegraph network means communication is almost instantaneous. As telegraph poles snake out alongside the railroad lines, this vast country begins to shrink.
All right. Here's Lincoln up here. I guess that's DC. Here's Chattanooga. He knows what's going on here. He knows the network goes all the way out west. He knows when you're sleeping and when you're awake. He knew when the generals were sleeping and when they were awake. He was able to coordinate and move his armies. The South, here's Richmond down here, had no such capability.
It will transform the nature of this war, as information and decisions can flow backwards and forwards at lightning speed.
It became kind of the early version of email. Suddenly it was possible to get a message to somebody from St. Louis, to get a message to New York in a shockingly short amount of time.
Lincoln immediately realizes the telegraph's potential as a weapon of war. He insists on the installation of telegraph lines directly into the War Department. He quickly acts to place all telegraph facilities in the Union under military control.
Talk about the network. All of those telegraph lines everywhere were plugged into each other and into DC. So he knows what's going on all the time.
The telegraph office becomes the central hub of Lincoln's war operation, his command and control center. He even takes to sleeping here at busy times. The telegraph office manager, David Homer Bates, describes how Lincoln obsesses over every scrap of news from the front, sometimes reading dispatches word by word as they are deciphered.
Lincoln's habit was to go immediately to the drawer each time he came into our room and read over the telegrams, beginning at the top until he came to the one he had seen on his previous visit.
The North Telegraph Network spreads its tentacles far and wide, sucking information back to Lincoln.
Soon as the soldiers showed up, even before the battle, you had the Signal Corps coming in with the cables and the poles to plug everything in.
And his commanders in Washington. It gives him a vast strategic overview, providing him an unrivaled insight into his commander's tactical thinking.
So I have no idea who that is. So you see all of the media, all of the innovations, and what a difference they made. I'll even write this down and post it. So to what extent did the union's communication superiority help them win? What do you think? At least 3 ways, as we said. The new technologies. Oop. Yeah, next time, we'll talk about next time in a minute. The mass media, newspapers, reached more people and unified the North. You had mass media, you had printing, you had not newspapers. Photography made it emotional and brought the war to it made it real, made it matter more. And it brought news to people everywhere. So you see all the things, and again, the book talks a lot about the printing press and how the high-speed press made a difference. But all of these things came together, and certainly the North had a lot of advantages. They had more people, they had more industrial capacity, but the new technologies unified the country, brought the war to people, and it made it faster. And guess what? The media only gets bigger and faster. This is what we'll talk about next time. We'll finish up.
North wins. Slavery's bad. Sorry.
Hey, what was that, Quentin?
I said North wins. Slavery's bad. Sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But yeah, after the war, media gets bigger and faster. And then the issue is, OMG, we got this thing we call the media. People start thinking of the media as this big, powerful entity. And if it's big and powerful, well, what do we do about it? What about ethics? Again, there was none of this stuff about truth or bias. No one cared. We assumed things were going to be not true, that they were going to be biased. That's one thing if you have a little print shop, but if you have a mass media, maybe folks should think at it a little differently. So we'll talk a little bit about the birth of the mass media, the effects that it had. We'll also talk about the telephone and the phonograph a little bit. So we'll finish up the 19th century Thursday. We will review for the test next Tuesday. And honestly, this test should be easier, I promise, because this stuff we're it's more thinking about the facts rather abstractly applying them. And I'll take stuff directly from the study guide. You'll do better. You'll do fine. Other questions? Oop, we have something in chat. All right. One new message down here. Okay. Thank you. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. People, yeah, that was good. You did like my little friend here. One more look. The guinea fowl says bye. He's going back in the yard and he will have, they're very good watchbirds. They'll go back in the yard in a second here. Anyway, other questions about what's going on? Okay. Have a great time. We will see you next time.